All right, good morning, everyone. Welcome to, what day is today? Wednesday? It's Wednesday.
It's Wednesday.
Today is Wednesday, middle of the week. I don't know that I have anything interesting to tell you, do I? Rafe, do I have anything interesting to tell you?
You told me yesterday.
I told you yesterday. All right. Let's see who's here. Where'd my cursor go? Oh, there it is. Okay. Let's see. Okay, so Basil's here. Good morning, Basil. Hassan is here. Good morning, Hassan. Simran is here. Good morning to you, Simran. Oasis is here. Good morning. Sean is here. Good morning, Sean. Basil's here. Good morning. Good morning, Basil. Jesse's here. Good morning, Jesse. Hamad is here. Good morning, Hamad. And Reza is here. Good morning, Reza. Okay, so let's see. Where were we yesterday? Oh, yes. Oh, yes, right? We were talking about the social construction of race in the United States, right? We said that race is a social category that's created for to assist with colonialism, right? Because again, if you're going to conquer other people and take over their countries, you kind of need to explain this to yourself, right? You need to explain this to your conscience somehow. How can you do such a thing? And race kind of helps people to do this, right? It's much easier when you think that these people are less than you, right? They're not as sophisticated, they're not as developed, maybe even they're not as human, right? And if you can kind of convince yourself of that, then it becomes much easier to treat people as they have been treated, right? And so here in the US, of course, British Europeans came over, they founded colonies, and then they kind of proceeded to take over the rest of the United States, right? Pushing indigenous people out of the way, funneling people in from Africa to work on their cotton plantations. And again, this was all justified by the fact that, these people were perceived as less than the Europeans, right? And the Europeans, of course, even went so far as to feel that it was their, burden, right? This was like, because we're so civilized, it's our job to now civilize other people, right? And this will be such a difficult task, right? But, because we're so sophisticated, I guess this is just what we have to do, right? Which is, quite entitled, right? But yeah, this is kind of what it was created for, right? So you can see that as the history of the United States goes on, or at least in the early part of the history of the United States, race becomes more important, right? And so the term race starts to show up in colonial law. They start having people declare their race on the census. They start making rules about how to determine who is in what race. And again, none of this would really matter except for the fact that, power and societal power and political power and rights were all kind of concentrated in the hands of white people, right? And so again, if you have equality in your society, good morning, if you have equality in your society, you don't need to bother with this, right? Because it doesn't matter. But here it did matter because they wanted to preserve control for white people, right? And so again, as this kind of becomes more developed, they start to have more rules about how to determine who is white and who is not, right? Because people who are white get rights and political power, and those who are not get less of those things, right? Yeah, and so even after slavery was abolished in 1865, so if you know anything about your American history, you'll know that the U.S. has a civil war, right, in the mid 1800s, and one of the major things that the north half of the country and the south half of the country are fighting about is whether they should be able to keep slaves, right? And so the north part of the U.S. is saying no, we're going to abolish slavery. This is not what we want to do. The southern half of the United States is saying no, we want to continue to keep slaves because this is how our economy works. Good morning. This is how our economy works, right? And so, so even after slavery is abolished, there are still pretty clear differences between what white people get and what non-white people get, right? And again, as you can see, there even some people that I think we would consider today to be white, at the time were not, right? So yeah, it's weird to think of Irish people as not being white, but indeed they were considered to be something else, right? So
and Italians as well.
yeah,
We weren't considered white until like recently.
yeah. So yeah, and Jewish people are, you know, when they walk down the street, you would, you know, they have similar skin color to me, but people often classify Jewish people as non-white as well. And so again, there's lots of like, you know, weird kind of prejudicial ideas that feed into, you know, who goes in what category, right? And again, like we mentioned, none of it is really biologically meaningful, right? We're all genetically very, very similar. Yeah, so in the US, in the history of the US, whiteness isn't, good morning, whiteness isn't merely a racial classification, but it's a social status, right? So it's not just to do with the color of your skin, it's about who has power and who doesn't, right? Good so far? Good? Okay. Now, today what I want to talk to you about is something we've touched on a little bit. We touched on a little bit earlier, but it sort of made sense at the time. But I want to talk about the social construction of race in Canada, okay? Because, you know, for Canadians, it's often very easy for us to look at the United States and we see, you know, the murder of George Floyd, and we see Black Lives Matter, and we see all this stuff happening. And it's very easy for us Canadians to look and say, oh gosh, you know, they're really messed up down there, those Americans, right? They've really got a racism problem, don't they? And it's true, they do, right? They've really got a lot of work to do and things to sort out. But that doesn't mean that there's nothing to do here at home, right? Because Canada is a country with racism as well, and it was founded in, you know, it was founded with racism kind of baked into the country, right? And so again, we can look at the U.S. and we can say, wow, what a mess, and true, it is a bit of a mess, but we have our own things to deal with here in Canada, right? We are not free of issues. And again, it's interesting because, you know, Canada's positioned itself as this very multicultural, very tolerant, very open kind of country, right? That's our reputation, is it not? More or less, yeah. More or less. That's what we market ourselves as, and you know, in many ways we are that, right? In many ways the marketing is true, but in other ways it's not quite, right? Especially when you look into our history, and that's kind of what I wanted to share with you now. So I'll start here at the beginning, right? Often we hear about Indigenous people in Canada and we kind of jump right in at residential schools, right? But there's kind of a bigger story to this, and I think it's important. And it's an interesting one, especially if you have an anthropology background, which I do. I find it pretty interesting. But Indigenous people are often called First Nations or First People, and the reason we call them that is that they were the first people that were here, right? And so if you go back, let's say 20,000 years, there is nobody in North America, okay? North America is basically peopleless. There's not a person here. There are some archaeological sites which kind of contradict that idea, however. There's a few, I think, in Southern America or South America that date to about 40,000 years ago. So as far as I remember, archaeologists aren't really sure how to explain those sites, but for the most part, there's nobody here, okay? And part of the reason that there's nobody here, do I have a good graphic? No. Part of the reason that there's nobody here is that if you look at that area between what's now Alaska and kind of northeast Russia, that area, as well as basically all of Canada, was covered in ice, okay? So if you think about 20 to 15,000 years ago, there's a giant block of ice sitting on top of Canada, about a kilometer thick, believe it or not, because it's an ice age, right? And the average global temperature has dropped by a degree or so, And so there's massive amounts of ice covering Canada, right? And so human beings evolve in Africa, as you can see here. They evolved in Africa maybe around 300,000 years ago or so. And then about 60,000 years ago, our species starts to leave Africa and they start to spread out across Asia, into Europe. They find their way into Southeast Asia and into Australia there by about 50,000 years ago. But really, nobody can get into North America because it's separated by water or it's covered by ice. But around 14,000 years ago or so, what happens is that the ice age starts to end, global temperatures increase, and the ice starts to melt. And so as this is as the ice is slowly melting, there's this kind of sweet spot where the ice is low. What's that?
Land was coming up.
Yeah, so the land is kind of reappearing from under the ice, but there's still a lot of ice, there's still a lot of seawater trapped in ice. So sea levels are actually lower than they are today. And so there's this kind of sweet spot where the ice is mostly gone, but the sea levels are still low. And so that northeast Russia, Alaska area is actually connected. And so you can just walk right across, which is exactly what people do. So people start to move in from that area. Some people kind of bounce down the coast. They have boats, and so they kind of find their way down the coast. But for the most part, starting around 15 or 14,000 years ago, people start to trickle into North America. And so these people are the ancestors to all First Nations people. So all the First Nations people in Canada, in the US, in Central America, in South America. If you know of the Inca or the Maya or the Aztecs, the ancestors of those people probably came through at the same time. And so, yeah, they're the first people because they literally are the first people. There are no human beings here before them. And so they kind of find their way in, and over the next 15,000 years, they start to reproduce and multiply and diversify, and they find their way into all kinds of different environments, right? And so one of the things to remember about Indigenous people is that we kind of think of them as one group, right? We've got Indigenous people and we've got non-Indigenous people, but Indigenous people actually are made up of quite a number of different cultures and different adaptations, right? So we have people out here on the West Coast who are, making canoes and fishing and sometimes hunting whales and living in big wooden houses. We've got people kind of in central Canada there that are following buffalo. Do you know what a buffalo is?
Indigenous people are the ones who were first to be in Canada.
Exactly. Yeah. And so, yeah, there's people in the center there who are hunting buffalo with bows and arrows, right? There's people out a little bit further to the east who are starting to create small farming communities. There's people in the north who are, living amongst the ice and, paddling around in kayaks and hunting sea mammals. There's all kinds of different adaptations, right? And so, again, when we talk about Indigenous people, we're really talking about a large number of cultures with different belief systems, different religions, different languages, different cultures, yeah. And so Indigenous culture is not one thing, it's actually quite a number of things. Although you could probably look at those cultures and say, okay, there's lots of similarities to them, right? They all kind of come from the same place. But they're also, each one is unique as well. And even, oh no, okay, I didn't have that. Yeah, and even if you look at BC, which you can't really clearly see here, but even if you look at province of British Columbia, if you look at a language map, you'll see that there are about 12 or so languages that are native to just this part of British Columbia. And so, yeah, it's very diverse, right? And it's very culturally rich. So they're not just one people, they're actually a bunch of people. Yes, they have a lot of similarities, but they're all distinct as well. So this story, of course, involves Canada, and this is the Canada that we know and love here. yeah, this is the Canada that we know and love. But the story starts out a lot earlier, right? So this is Canada today. But if you go back to 1867, July 1st, 1867, which we just celebrated, or maybe didn't celebrate last week, if you go back to then, you'll see that Canada looked a little more like this. So, you can see Ontario and Quebec aren't really fully formed yet, right? They're just small pieces. And then we've got Nova Scotia and New Brunswick and Prince Edward Island there. They're still part of Canada, of course, and they're kind of the first provinces to join Confederation, right? And so the idea here is that a bunch of these areas were kind of developing on their own. They were their own colony. And then a bunch of guys led by our first Prime Minister, John A. Macdonald, kind of got together and said, hey, all of you colonies, we should get together and be a country, right? We should actually form this. And so he and a bunch of other guys worked hard to convince the leaders of Quebec and Ontario and Nova Scotia and so on that they should all be in this thing together, right? They should all join into this federation called Canada. And so John A. Macdonald is able to kind of sell the idea to the other provinces, and they do. And so Canada's kind of interesting because, again, it starts out with just 5 provinces, but the other provinces join willingly, right? So it's something you kind of enter into. So it's not a case of, Canada conquering the rest of this territory, but more, provinces appearing and then choosing to enter into this relationship with the other ones. And so, but here at the time, you can see that, there's 5 provinces. Some of the provinces aren't really their full size, or at least they're not, they haven't expanded to their future size. Out here, we've got something called Rupert's Land. Rupert's Land was actually given to the Hudson's Bay Company to operate in. And so Hudson's Bay was a British company. They were doing a lot of trading in furs. You know how people in movies, those old-time movies, they wear those top hats? Oh, good day to you, sir, right? Yeah. Those hats are all made of fur, usually beaver, sometimes rabbit. What's that? Yeah? Yeah. They're made of beaver or rabbit fur. And so where are you going to get all these beavers and rabbits? Well, you're going to trade with the Indigenous people in Canada here for these things. And so Hudson's Bay Company, which is actually still downtown, it's the Bay. That's the same company, by the way, from 16 or 1700, whenever they're incorporated. Same company is kind of given this area by the British government to say, this is your land. You can go and trade with Indigenous people there, but you're on your own, right? We're not doing anything. We're not providing you with any protection. It's up to you, right? There's some Northwest Territory here, which is sort of claimed by the UK, but there's nothing up there really. And then British Columbia is kind of a colony, if you will, but it's still not a province, right? So again, at Confederation, this is what Canada looks like. But again, if you go back even further, you'll see that, again, Canada is really just a loose area in which Europeans have settled, right, and colonized. And so, again, it starts out as a very kind of, simple arrangement. Good morning. A very simple arrangement here. And again, people are coming here for a number of reasons. Europeans are coming here for a number of reasons. Some of them are missionaries, right? So they're literally on a mission to convert people to a Christian religion, right? Some people are explorers. Some people are looking for a better life. And then some people are traders, right? They're business people. And so when Europeans first arrive, we're not really sure how many Indigenous people are here in Canada. Okay, there's no census. There's no way to tell. You can see here that estimates range from about 200,000 to 500,000 people in Canada. Again, we could have had as many as 2.5 million Indigenous people, but again, it's really hard to tell, right? There was no way to count. And again, but look at that, about 300 to 450 different languages were spoken here before Europeans came, right? So again, very diverse, right? So 1600, we've got the first missionaries showing up. And at the same time, we have trade alliances between Europeans and between indigenous people, right? And this is a pretty equal relationship, right? So Europeans come to North America, and they have stuff that, the indigenous people would like to trade for, right? Metal axe heads, matches, later on rifles with bullets. You know, Europeans have technology that indigenous people don't have, right? And they're happy to blankets, and they're happy to trade for it. Actually, if you go, has anyone been to the Bay, the department store?
Yeah.
And you know how they have those blankets with the colors? They're kind of a white blanket. Yeah, those are the blankets they were trading to indigenous people hundreds of years ago. It's the same design. Yeah, that's why they kind of continue to sell it, because it's a very historical thing. But yeah, these first traders from Hudson's Bay would trade, like axe heads, matches, things like that, but also blankets. And the blankets looked like the ones you buy today, same design, which is really interesting. So yeah, it's kind of an equal relationship, right? Indigenous people want to trade with the Europeans because they've got cool stuff, right? The Europeans want to trade with indigenous people because they want furs for their fancy hats, right? And it's kind of a reasonably equal relationship, right? But of course, Europeans are going to depend on indigenous people to survive, right? They're in a new place. They don't know, they've never been here before. They've never seen a grizzly bear before, right?
They
Just-
don't know much about
they didn't really know anything about this land, right? So indigenous people had to kind of teach them. So you can kind of see this here. You can kind of see this, I think, relationship shown in this image. And this image it's not a drawing from the time. It's drawn later on. But if you were to kind of look at this image and kind of analyze it from an artistic point of view, how would you describe the relationship between these two groups of people? What do you notice about the image? What's that?
The European looks like he's giving orders.
Okay, the European guy looks like he's giving orders. Okay, Ben, what were you gonna say?
It's a high tension. It looks like there's a lot of tension.
Do you sense, what makes you think this is a tense scene?
I mean, I feel like all of the indigenous people are there just to talk.
They've all shown up, right? So this is
That's
some,
a good sign.
well, it's somewhat of an event, right? The people are showing up. I see there's a priest back there, I think. Do you see him? Kind of in the middle, just to the right.
Yeah.
He looks like a missionary of some sort, I think.
Catholic.
What do you notice about what do the facial expressions look like from these?
Controlling
What?
some group.
Huh?
I think some group of people who have more power. The group that group gonna control the another group.
Yes, but who's in control here?
India. I don't know what that called.
These guys here, the indigenous people. Why do you think they're in control?
Because they have less technology.
Okay. Right, so we can see some, they're holding some technology. Ben, what were you thinking? Did you see anything on closer inspection?
Looks like they're having a barter trade.
They're having a what?
They're doing a trade or something.
Could be, right? Yeah, let's look at the European guys here. So there's one guy standing there and a few of his buddies kind of hanging out in the trees behind him. What's this kind of gesture, do you think? What does this mean?
Often.
An offer?
You want to be friends?
Want to be friends? Yeah, like you're extending a hand to someone, right? You're extending a hand. You've got your hand open, so you're like, I don't have a weapon in it, right? You're like, hey, we come in peace, right?
Would you
Kind
love to please hand for something to offer or some peaceful consideration?
Yeah, right? He's kind of hanging back. He's got his hat off, which is very polite for Europeans. I'm sure the indigenous people didn't really notice it, but he took his hat off, which Europeans do when they want to be polite, ma'am, right? And then he extends the hand, right? And so, what are the indigenous people? What's their kind of facial expression or expressions?
They're
They look kind of serious.
Kind of serious.
seriously confused.
Yeah. Yeah, they're like this strange pale man has just observed or emerged from the forest. He speaks a language we've never heard before. He's dressed very strangely. He seems to be making sounds at us.
They're bewildered.
What should we do? Right? Yeah, so I think they're serious, right? They're like, You know, you can almost see these guys talking it out here, like, hey, what do you think? You know, what do you make of this guy, right? Yeah. Do they seem alarmed?
Not really.
No.
Because some women are sitting and relaxed, and they're just standing and talking to them normally.
Right, yeah. So the women are just sitting there. They don't seem upset, right? They're just sitting having a conversation. They seem pretty peaceful looking, right? And so, yeah, this isn't kind of a tense scene, right? The other thing I might draw your attention to is the sort of, now there might be some perspective involved here, but look at the size of the people, right? The indigenous people here they look gigantic. Yeah, and he looks tiny, right? He looks like he's this tall, right? And again, you know, maybe there's a little bit of perspective in this image here, but yeah, he doesn't look very powerful at all, right? He's kind of emerging from the trees. His friends are kind of hiding behind him, and he's like, "Oh, we come in peace, you indigenous people. Look, I have no weapon, right?
Mm-hmm.
I have my hat off in a very polite gesture." And the indigenous people are, you know, not frightened, but they're just like, this is very peculiar, right? And so, but again, that's kind of how the initial relationship was, right? Is that it was either reasonably equal, or it was indigenous people who had the power, right? They certainly had the numbers to begin with, right? There was certainly more of them than there was Europeans. And of course, Europeans didn't really know their way around, right? They didn't really know where they were. They didn't quite know how to survive here. And so they did rely on indigenous people to help them. And of course, they wanted to keep the business relationship going because they wanted the furs, right? Yeah, so here's another, you know, very kind of simple image. I'm not sure if this is from the time or not. This is an older one. But again, you can see kind of a very equal relationship and not a lot of tension, right? They're trading furs here, you know, the two head traders, and then, you know, their buddies are just kind of hanging out, smoking a pipe, you know, no big deal, right? But of course, you know, as you probably know, the relationship isn't going to stay this way, right? More and more Europeans will come to North America, and as they do, bad things will start to happen for indigenous people, okay? One of the first things to happen, which is not entirely, doesn't happen on purpose, but is the introduction of European diseases, right? So all of these diseases, smallpox, tuberculosis, measles, they're all European diseases, right? They've appeared in Europe. People have suffered from them for hundreds of years. And so Europeans have some sort of an immunity built up to them, more or less, right? But for indigenous people, and this is, you know, this should make sense in a post-COVID world for us, indigenous people have no immunity to these, right? And these are pretty heavy diseases, right? These are worse than COVID. You don't want tuberculosis, right? You don't want smallpox.
Those are called non-recoverable.
They're what?
Non-recoverable.
Yeah, they're serious,
They're
right?
hard to cure.
Yeah, they're hard to cure, especially in 1600.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so, yeah, indigenous people contract these diseases very easily, and they spread very quickly because, again, they've never seen these things before. They don't know what they are, and again, there's no real medicine. There's no cure for this stuff, And so massive amounts of indigenous people die in the process. And this is traumatic, of course. Like even if even if losing, I don't know, 40% of your community wasn't awful enough. One thing we should remember is that for most indigenous groups, they don't write anything down. Okay, so they are non-literate societies, and again, not because they couldn't figure it out, but because they didn't really need to. Right? If you look back at the invention of writing, and I'm sorry to tell you this, it's a bummer, but writing is invented for accounting. Right? It's invented to keep track of taxes for kings, for early kings in Mesopotamia and Egypt and places like that. That's why they invent writing in the first place. But of course, indigenous people don't have any kings or rulers, they don't have any taxes, and so there's no reason to bother to write anything down. And so all of their knowledge, everything they know, all of their history, their stories, their mythology, their religious practices, all of the skills that they need to survive in the wilderness with nothing at all of those are passed down orally, right? They're all stored up here. And so, and most of it's stored with the elders, right? Most of it's stored with the oldest people, right? The people who know the most. And of course, who's going to be most susceptible to disease? Yeah, the elders, right? And so not only do indigenous communities lose, a significant percentage of their communities, but a lot of it is elders, a lot of it is old people. And so they're going to, their cultures they're going to suffer culture loss here because their data isn't backed up, right? Like it's in the minds of of the elders and of the people, and it's passed down from generation to generation. If you kill a bunch of them off, it's gone, right? Like you can't get it back. Here, because it's not written down, yeah. If you write it down, you can always go back and read, right? But there's none of that is happening. So, it's a very traumatic loss because all of these people are dying, but you're also losing pieces of your culture because, culture is remembered, right? There's another thing that happens at this time, and it may not seem like a very important thing, but it kind of is. And it's this royal proclamation in 1763. And what it says, well, it says this. It says that only the crown could acquire lands from First Nations people and only by treaty. Okay? So, again, this doesn't seem like much. What's a proclamation? Just in general. Yeah, it is a law, right? It's something. To proclaim something is to say it, right? I proclaim this will be a day of remembrance, henceforth into eternity, blah, blah, blah. I don't know. So it kind of carries the force of law, right? But it's, but it comes from a king, right? And here it's the king, I think it's King George at the time. George says that, hey, all of you colonists who are coming to the New World, who are coming to North America, you're not allowed to buy land from indigenous people, okay? So the crown, as in the government will acquire lands from the indigenous people, and then we'll sell it to you. So the British government is not honoring any sort of sale contracts between indigenous people and colonists. The crown will acquire the land, and then the crown will sell it to the colonists, okay? So again, it doesn't sound like much, right? It sounds pretty boring, right? But implied in this is the idea that who's the original owner of the land? Yeah, First Nations people. And the British government kind of admits it here. They're like, yeah, we will acquire the land from the indigenous people. What?
They had a plan that they're going to take
Yeah, they did want to acquire the land, but they also kind of admit that it was theirs to begin with, right? We will acquire it from them because they currently own it. Kind of a little bit, yeah. Yeah, the government wanted to make sure that they had control of the land, right? And people weren't just, buying up like, yeah, I bought all of Quebec. Here's my sale contract, right? The government doesn't, the crown doesn't want that, right? They're going to say, no, you didn't buy all of Quebec, you idiot. We'll acquire it and we'll sell it to you, right? So that's kind of what they're doing. But again, for Indigenous people, this is important, and it continues to be important because the government here admits that the land was theirs, right? It belonged to the Indigenous people, and that the crown was going to find a way to acquire it. But in order to do that, you have to kind of admit that it's theirs to start, right? So it's kind of an admission that it's their land. So again, lots and lots of people die of disease here, starting in 1600, but all the way through into the 1800s, okay? So some of these diseases will be difficult to treat. Vaccines will not be invented yet. And as we'll find out, the Canadian government isn't really too interested in healing the Indigenous people anyway. And so disease is going to kind of run through their communities, and Indigenous people will have no defense, right? But again, the introduction of these diseases is not on purpose, right? It just, as we've seen, disease travels on its own very easily, and so Europeans didn't mean to bring these diseases with them, they just did, right? And Indigenous people happened to have no immunity because those diseases didn't exist here. So that was kind of an accident, but other things that happen aren't. And so Indigenous people suffer, population loss, they suffer cultural loss, but then the Canadian government starts to work in order to push them aside, okay? And the reason is, I just want to go back to an earlier slide. I just got to figure out what number it is. Yes, okay. So, when Canada becomes a country here in 1867, the dream, so John A. Macdonald, our first prime minister, he gets all these provinces together into a confederation, but he has a dream, right? And his dream is a nation that stretches from sea to shining sea, right? That is his dream. And so he's got to kind of find a way to, incorporate all of this land into Canada, which is going to be difficult, right? Because we've got a colony out here on the west called British Columbia, right? British Columbia is maybe interested in joining, but they want a few things. The main thing they want is a railroad that stretches from eastern Canada to western Canada, because they don't want to be left out. So they want a big long railway, and they're sort of negotiating with John A. Macdonald to get it. But in the middle, there's kind of nothing, right? There's nothing there. And John A. Macdonald and other Canadian government officials are worried about the United States, because the United States is kind of spreading westward as well, right? In this period, we're almost into the period of the Old West kind of thing, if you've seen the old Westerns. That's kind of like the 1870s, 1880s. So they're kind of having that period in the United States as people kind of, move from the original 13 colonies that started out in the US, and they start to move westward. And so John A. Macdonald is worried that, if we get Americans coming north and they settle, then they're going to think it's theirs, we'll never get rid of them, and we'll never have our country from sea to shining sea, right? So the Canadian government starts to advertise for and import immigrants, right? First from Britain, but later from Eastern Europe, lots from Ukraine and other places. And they're kind of settling people in the middle of Canada in order to kind of fill out that middle section, right? So if we've got a bunch of Canadians in there, that should keep the Americans from coming in and taking over the place, right? And so they start to kind of import these immigrants in there to farm, yeah.
So at the beginning, there were not a lot, did the population was low compared to
Well, as compared to today, absolutely, right? So almost all Indigenous people here in Canada were hunter-gatherers, right? And so they hunted animals, they gathered plants, they fished, so they didn't do any farming for the most part. And to do that, you have to have pretty low population numbers. you know, the land will only kind of support a certain number of people naturally, carrying capacity, if you're interested. And so, you know, as compared to what we have today, yeah, there weren't a lot of indigenous people, but they were there, right? And this was a place that they lived and hunted and moved around. And so they were definitely, there was definitely a population. So when I say nothing, I say nothing from European standards, right? European standards, there was nothing. But of course, what there was, you know, the homes of indigenous people, right? And where they moved around and hunted and fished and gathered and lived their lives, right? Until, of course, those, you know, immigrants started coming in. They were settled in central Canada and they were encouraged to farm, right? Now, as that was happening, the Canadian government embarked on an effort to eradicate the bison. Okay, do you know what a bison is? It's a this. That is a bison. So you probably won't see too many of them. There's none in BC. If you go to Banff National Park in Alberta, you may see some. You can see them kind of, they used to live in central Canada in the sort of flat areas. So they're kind of native to Alberta and Saskatchewan and Manitoba. They are very large. You know, at the shoulder, that guy's probably it's probably a good 6 feet at the shoulder. So they're big animals. Do not approach one if you see one. They are cranky. They're not I don't know if they're endangered, but there are far, far fewer of them than there used to be. The story is that when Europeans first came to central Canada, there were herds of these guys in the millions. And so, like, if you stood up on a hill, it would look like a brown carpet was moving across the land. There was so many of them, right? And many indigenous people in central Canada hunted these for their livelihood. And the bison here gave them just about everything they needed, right? So they ate the flesh and the organs of the bison. They used the bones and the horns and the hooves to make tools and things like that. They used the skin from the bison to make clothes for themselves and to make the covering for their teepees, you know, those sort of triangular things. Yeah, those are covered in the skin of bison. And so the bison provided just about everything that indigenous people needed, right? And so they hunted them for hundreds or maybe thousands of years, of course only taking what they needed to take. But of course for the Canadian government, these things were a nuisance, right? Number one, they were supporting the indigenous people, but number two, you can't have successful farms when you have a carpet of these things moving across the landscape, right? They'll destroy your farm, probably eat all your crops and stomp it into dust, right? So you can't have these guys. And so the Canadian government starts to offer bounties. So they offer you money for every bison that you shoot. And so Europeans start to shoot them in pretty significant numbers. And so that is actually a pile of bison skulls that you're looking at. Yeah. Yeah. It's what? I don't know. Yeah, I don't know how to estimate the number of. There's a lot of bison skulls, right? And that's just one pile, right? Never mind other piles that existed. And so again, there were millions of these things, and Europeans kind of just went around and shot them all, right? And you know, for indigenous people, this was horrible, right? Number one, it was a waste because Europeans would just shoot them and leave them, right? They wouldn't eat them. And of course, indigenous people relied on these animals for their food. Like everything they needed came from this animal, right? And everything, right? Your food, your clothing, your tools, all of it comes from this animal. And so when this animal is gone, what do you do? To where? Where you can find, but that's the thing, right? Is that as time goes on, yeah, they probably do move at first, but as time goes on, like there's nowhere left to move, right? Because if you look, let me just see here. Where's the one I'm looking for? Oh yeah. If you look, like, you know, yes, there's not a huge quantity of people in Canada, but there's other Indigenous people around too, right? And so if you leave your territory, you're going to be moving into someone else's, right? And are they going to be happy about that? Are they going to let you into their land? Can their land support both you and them? I don't know, right? And again, you can't, you've got Indigenous people all around you. If you go south, you've got Indigenous people down there, but you've also got Americans who are kind of taking over the West, so it's the same thing further to the south. And so as European populations rise and more farmers show up and more bison are killed, and basically to the point where almost all of them are killed. Again, now you can really only see them in national parks. Again, I don't know if they're technically endangered or not, but there's not, there were millions and millions of them, and now there's very few. But yeah, like where do you go, right? Eventually, you're stuck in your home range, but all of the animals that you relied on are gone. So what do you do, right? Well, what you do is you make a deal,
They're
right?
red listed.
They're what?
They're red listed.
Red listed?
They're nearly, yeah, they're threatened with genocide.
Wow. There's yeah, there here in I guess that's true. Where I used to live in Edmonton, there was a national provincial park or national provincial park outside of Edmonton called Elk Island, or no, it's a national park. Sorry, and they actually have a couple of herds of bison in the park, and so the park is kind of fenced in so that they can't get out. But the park's quite big, so you can actually go and drive around, and sometimes you see the bison, and which is kind of cool. But yeah, they're not just wandering around. They're not just wandering around the landscape, right? They're in particular places. Yeah, I guess there's probably fewer than I thought. Yeah, so when all that stuff is gone, you make a deal, right? And so that's what Indigenous people start to do. They start to say, okay, Canadian government, clearly, you're in charge now, and more Europeans are coming, and railways are being produced, and people are farming, and towns are popping up. Clearly, you're not going anywhere. Clearly, life is changing for us. Let's make a deal here, right? Let's kind of formalize our relationship, right? And so that's what treaties are about, right? They're agreements between Indigenous people and the Canadian government that kind of outline their relationship, right? Outline their responsibilities and obligations to each other. But the treaties are kind of problematic. But maybe what I'll do is let's take a break, and then I'll come back to the treaties after, because we've been going for an hour. So yeah, let's take a little break, and then when we come back, we'll do that. Okay, and we are back. So, as I say, what do you do when, you know, the homeland that you've lived in for thousands of years is suddenly slowly invaded by white people and they build railways and towns and farms and kill all of your bison, right? What do you do? Well, you kind of have to make a deal, right? You have to kind of formalize the relationship so that your culture is protected, right? And so this is what Indigenous people were looking for when they sat down at the bargaining table with the Canadian government, right? They were trying to establish the physical survival of their people, right? So their population numbers had declined, right, because of diseases that Europeans introduced. Their way of life was threatened. Their existence was threatened, and so they sat down and said, "Yeah, let's make a deal because we want to make sure that our people survive, right? That our way of life survives." Again, they were also looking to establish some sort of mutual, peaceful relationship with the government, right? They didn't really want to fight with the government. They didn't really want a war. They just wanted to, you know, create some sort of equal relationship so that they could talk to each other, right?
Was it like a truce?
It wasn't so much a truce because it wasn't, even though there were conflicts between Indigenous people and the Canadian government, they weren't technically at war. So it wasn't really a truce. It was just like, okay, let's, you know, we've kind of been, we've kind of been, you know, trying to figure this relationship out, you know, in kind of a, I want to use the word ad hoc, but I don't know if you've encountered it. In sort of, you know, they tried to sort of negotiate things in an ad hoc way for a long time, but they wanted to formalize that relationship, right? What really are your responsibilities to us, right? What are our obligations to you? What are you allowed to do? What are we allowed to do, right? Let's formalize it, right?
Did
Let's.
Indigenous people fight back?
Some did. I mean, you know that it's a difficult question, right? Did they fight back? I think that they did, but you know, this is a slow process, right? And so keep in mind that, you know, when, you know, the New World, right, in North and South America were discovered in 1492, right? And so it took about 100 years for, you know, Europeans to really start coming to Canada in any kind of numbers, right? So here we're at like 1871, so we're almost 300 years later, right? So it's a long process, right? So people start to trickle in slowly, you know, disease starts to, you know, decline populations, the buffalo start to disappear. You know, this is,
Really slow.
well, yeah, it's a little more gradual, right? It doesn't all happen in a month kind of thing. I think if it happened in a month, yeah, they probably would have, you know, pulled out their bows and arrows and started fighting, but it happens very slowly. And again, you know, the nature of Indigenous relationships with Canadians changes, right? So it starts out as kind of a business relationship, right, of trade. There are conflicts. There is warfare between involving Indigenous people. Sometimes the Indigenous people are fighting other Indigenous people. Sometimes the Indigenous people are fighting either the British or the French. Sometimes Indigenous people are helping the British to fight the French, who have Indigenous people helping them. Sometimes Indigenous people are participating in War of 1812, trying to keep the U.S. from taking over Canada. So, you know, it's a complicated thing, right? Sometimes, you know, sometimes the two groups are fighting. Sometimes they're allied. Sometimes they're fighting against each other because they're allied with other people, and you know, it's complicated, right?
These treaties are demanded by the Indigenous people.
Yeah, they're the ones who kind of come and say, okay, look, let's make a deal here, right? Let's figure out what our responsibilities are. And again, they also know that they're going to have to transition to a new way of living, right? Because again, they know their world is changing, right? They're not stupid, right? They know that things are changing, and they they will need to adapt, right? And so this is kind of what they want from the government. And so this is very often shown. It comes from, actually, I'm not even sure how old it is. It's quite old. It's a belt, okay, is what it is, and it's woven with beads. So Indigenous people have created this belt of beads, and it's kind of symbolic of what they were looking for when they went to talk to Canadian government officials. What do you think these two blue lines, what do you think they symbolize? Because they are symbols. Peace, okay. You know, in a way, yes, but
And it looks like a water line,
okay,
waterways,
okay.
something.
Two waterways,
Yeah.
yeah,
like
yeah,
that. Water color is blue.
yeah,
So are the lines.
yeah, yeah. So yeah, we have two waterways, right? Like two parallel rivers, if you will, right? And so, yeah, the Indigenous people are saying, okay, well, you paddle down your river, right, and we'll paddle down our river, and we're kind of beside each other, and maybe we're going in the same direction, but we're kind of each doing our own thing, right? We're each paddling our own boat, if you will, right? And so, yeah, this was kind of a good representation of what Indigenous people were looking for, right? An equal relationship. You know, we're beside each other, we're kind of pointed in the same direction, but you kind of do your thing, we'll do our thing over here, and we'll be good, right? But of course, that's not really what the Canadian government had in mind, right? The Canadian government was looking to actually acquire this land, like we mentioned earlier, right? So they wanted to acquire the land for farmers, they wanted to fish, they wanted to mine and cut down trees and all kinds of things that we do today. The government wanted access to the land to do that, and they kind of needed Indigenous people out of the way, right? So, yeah, they were looking to buy the land, right? They wanted to encourage rapid settlement of the West, right? Like I said, they couldn't have their, you know, country from sea to shining sea unless they filled in that center part of Canada, right? And so they wanted to get people in there, get them farming, get towns created and railroads so that the Americans would not move north, because you know how Americans are, they just like to take over everything. No, I'm just kidding. And again, they also wanted to respond to First Nations request for treaty benefits. So again, Indigenous people were saying, hey, let's strike a deal here, right? And the government wanted to do it.
Hasn't Canadian government reduced the government of which is led by Johnny MacDonald?
At this point, it is, well, where are we now? 1871. I forget if he's still prime minister or not. I forget the dates.
He was prime minister twice.
That sounds right. Let's see. Sir, well, here, let's put him on the screen, shall we? There he is. Sir John A. Macdonald, born 1815, first Prime Minister of Canada, in office 1878. Okay, 67 to 73, and then yeah, 78 to 91. So yeah, he would have been present for some of these negotiations, or at least prime minister at the time that they were going on. He was also apparently quite a drinker. He liked to, during government business, he'd have a glass of water on his desk, but it wasn't water. It was something a little more, something also clear but more powerful. But anyway, so yes, yeah. So John A. Macdonald would have been kind of present for some of these things, but this is what the government wanted to do, and this is where a big kind of cultural clash happens here, because the first thing is that the government wants to buy the land from Indigenous people, right? And again, we're very familiar with buying land, right? Buying and selling land. That's very normal for us, right? But for indigenous people, it's not normal because indigenous people and most hunter gatherers around the world don't really have a concept of ownership. You can't really own things. And we talked about this when we talked about the Christopher Ryan video, you know, when he talked about how human sexuality evolved. And he said that, you know, hunter-gatherers are fiercely egalitarian. They demand things be shared, right? And indigenous people are very similar. They demand things be shared. And so there's not really a lot of private property, private ownership in
There are
these.
no people that land is for everyone.
Yeah, right. So indigenous people feel that, you know, that they belong to the land, that they're part of the land, that the land takes care of them. The land is kind of like your mother, right? It nurtures you, but you can't really own your mother, can you? No, that's weird, right? That's a really weird idea to think that you could own her or that you could sell her, right? Like, yeah, I could use the cash. Maybe I'll just, you know, sell my mom next week, right? But that's a weird thing, right? That's a weird thing to say. But similarly weird is, oh, I'm going to sell this piece of land, right? Because the indigenous people are like, what are you talking about? Like, how can you own land, right? And again, it's hard for us to get into that mindset because we're so, you know, owning land is like a no-brainer. Of course you do, right? You buy it, you sell it, whatever. Yeah, that's what you do. But for them, it's a totally foreign concept, right? It's like selling your mom for spare cash, right? It's bizarre. You can't imagine it. So here you can see that there's going to be an issue here because the Canadian government is going to come in and say, okay, sign here, and that says we own your land. And the indigenous people are going to say, okay, we'll sign here, and that means that you may come into our land and, you know, live here, right? So indigenous people are almost thinking about right of access, right? I don't own this land, but we have right to this land, right? This is where we come from, and we're the ones who can sort of tell you that you can come into it or refuse you. And the government is saying, sign here, and then we own it, and we can do whatever we want with it. Right? So those are,
They didn't understand.
yeah. There was a bit of a gap, right?
Did you say they were taking advantage of?
Well, many people would say that they were, and the reason. Sorry, go ahead.
And he said the indigenous people.
They what?
Right. So
Yeah.
we're pretty sure we're another person on the thing.
Yeah. Part of the issue, yeah, was that most indigenous people were non-literate, right? They couldn't read, and so they needed someone else to tell them what the contract said, right? So that was an issue. As it turned out, indigenous people were really good negotiators. And so, you know, so let's say the Canadian government official goes to a village and he sits down, and he's like, okay, let's negotiate this treaty. And they sit there and they negotiate for, you know, a week or a month or whatever it takes. And they finally get an agreement. But the next village down, they'd have someone in that first village. And so once they figured out the agreement, that person would go home. And then when the Canadian government agent went to the next place, they would say, okay, we know what you gave to that last village. That's our starting point. What else can you give us? And so they were actually, yeah, they're smart and they're really good negotiators. But again, it's a problem when you can't read what you're signing, right? The other thing is that, you know, for indigenous people, treaty is about relationship, right? And relationships are constantly being renegotiated, right? They're constantly being worked on and understood. But contracts are not like that, right? Contracts are, this is what you're responsible for, this is what you must deliver, sign here, right? Contracts can't really be renegotiated. Well, they can, but you have to agree to sit down and renegotiate them. Otherwise, they are bulletproof, right? You're held to the letter of the contract. But again, indigenous people are more about relationship, right? And it's about kind of working through these things. And so, again, the idea of contracts was, you know, culturally in conflict with how they normally worked. The idea of land ownership made no sense. And again, they couldn't read what they were signing, right? And so, yeah, what a lot of Indigenous groups found is that things that they negotiated didn't show up in the final version of the contract. But of course, they didn't know until after they signed. So they negotiated for things, and then they were left out mysteriously, or maybe not so mysteriously. So, yeah, so this is what Indigenous people had asked for. Okay, so this is what they negotiated. So they negotiated reserve lands. Okay, so land that was to be set aside for their use, right? So they could continue their way of life. But they also wanted farm animals and equipment, right? They needed to transition to farming, and they never had before, so they needed some equipment to get started. They wanted some payments. They wanted education for their children, right? They knew that this new world that was being created in Canada was different from the one that they were used to, and that their kids were going to need new skills that they didn't have, which is familiar, right? Because I think most of our parents probably feel or felt that way, right? That yes, my kids are going to need skills, and maybe they're skills that I don't have. I need somebody else to teach them. So Indigenous people are the same as our parents in that regard, right? They want education for their kids, right? They asked for ammunition and clothing, and they of course wanted their continual right to fish and hunt in their territory, right? But again, yeah, some of the things that they negotiated didn't show up in the final version, right? And so, again, rather suspicious, wouldn't you say? This is kind of a long quote here, but it says this is kind of towards the end of treaty signings, where Indigenous people are kind of the ones who sign early are able to negotiate because they're in a stronger position. The ones who sign late are basically running out of food, their communities have been ravaged by disease, and they're really suffering. And so, again, the people who sign early get to negotiate. The people who sign later are basically so desperate to sign any agreement that they sign it, right? They don't negotiate. They're like, okay, you're going to give us this stuff, great. Where do I put my X? And so here, this is from a later period, but it says here, the treaty was signed not after serious negotiations nor with any spirit of compromise. Governor Laird, I guess the government agent, had come to the session with the treaty in his pocket, right? So again, later on, there's no negotiation happening, right? The Indians too had come with their demands in readiness, and when they parted company, the commissioners had a document which said that the Blackfoot, who are an Indigenous group, the Blackfoot had surrendered their lands. The chiefs, on the other hand, believed that they had been promised protection for the buffalo herds and treaty money for allowing the white man to come into their ancestral grounds. Yet, neither side had really understood what they'd given away. To Laird, buffalo preservation and firewood compensation were minor considerations not to be taken seriously. To the chiefs, the selling of the land and the allotment of reserves was beyond their comprehension, right? So the government wasn't too interested in providing what Indigenous people wanted, and Indigenous people had no idea what they were signing on for, right? They didn't really understand what the Canadian government intended to do. And again, it's much more difficult when the other person signing the contract has no, isn't going to honor the contract, right? So this is kind of, now it's going to be pretty rough. Well, it already is rough for Indigenous people, but it's going to get rougher, right? In 1876, they passed the Indian Act. And the Indian Act is a piece of legislation in Canada, and it doesn't, but it wasn't negotiated with Indigenous people, okay? So it's just something that the government passes. And so what it does, the Indian Act, is that it explains kind of the relationship between Indigenous people and the Canadian government, okay? And so, but it becomes much more than that. Again, it starts out, sorry, I'm just losing my train of thought here. It starts out as I guess it starts as a tool of assimilation. It starts out because both of these two things here, you'll see that it was developed from Gradual Civilization Act and Gradual Enfranchisement Act. Both of those were meant to encourage indigenous people to adopt the white way of life, right? And so if you started a farm and if you kind of renounced your, Indian identity, then you could kind of become Canadian and maybe be given the rights of Canadians. And so it was meant to encourage indigenous people to sort of start living the European lifestyle rather than their own. Right? Neither of these two things actually worked. Nobody wanted to do it, but it was there. And so the Indian Act kind of was passed. There was lots of amendments to it. And within the Indian Act, there was all kinds of things added that basically negated the signing of the treaties. Okay, so it kind of went against it. And so they had, there were rules saying that indigenous people could not wear their traditional clothing in public without a permit from the Indian agent. And the Indian agent was a member of the Canadian government that was sort of in charge of their land, in charge of their reserve. They couldn't practice any of their traditional ceremonies or rituals, right? These things were made illegal. They were outlawed. There was, later on, indigenous people couldn't leave their reserve without permission from the Indian agent. There was all kinds of things that were meant to kind of take away power from indigenous people, right? How do you know who's an Indian, who's a status Indian, and who gets benefits from the government? Well, the government will tell you, right? Because the government sets the rules for who is indigenous and who isn't, right? They also had mechanisms built in here where if an indigenous woman married a white man, she would lose her status. She would lose her Indian status, and her kids would lose their Indian status as well. And so all of these things were kind of set up in order to kind of limit the lives of indigenous people, keep them on the reserve, and hopefully assimilate them into Canadian society. And if you doubt the desire of this piece of legislation here to assimilate people, I'll refer you to this quote here. So this is Duncan Campbell Scott, the Minister of Indian Affairs in 1893. I want to get rid of the Indian problem. Our object is to continue until there is not a single Indian in Canada that has not been absorbed into the body politic. And there is no Indian question and no Indian department, and that is the whole objective of this bill.
Does the term Indian attributes to indigenous people?
Yes, sorry, I should have mentioned that earlier. So the story goes that when Christopher Columbus arrived in the New World in 1492, he landed, he got out of his boat, and he thought he was in India, because that's what he was looking for, right? He was looking for a passage to India. And so he got out of the boat, he looked around, he saw people, and he was like, oh, Indians, right? Turns out, not India, not Indians, but the name kind of stuck, okay? And so they continued to call indigenous people in North America Indians, even though, yeah, not from India, no relation, but the name sticks. Here, we don't really use it anymore because it's kind of, it's a difficult word. Like, it doesn't, like, it's wrong, right? Because they're not Indians. But because it sort of found its way into legal documents, we're kind of stuck with it, right? So we talk about the Indian Act because that's what it's actually called, because it was passed in 1876. But really, outside of talking about the legislation, we don't use Indian anymore because it's just not.
Name actually prevailed from the past.
Yeah, but but it's wrong, right? But yeah, you can pretty clearly see here that, this is what they're trying to do. They want to absorb indigenous people into Canada so that there aren't any anymore, right? And so the Indian Act went about kind of abolishing First Nations governance, right? So their ability to kind of govern themselves, their ability to educate themselves. It attempted to make their cultural practices illegal. It took them and sort of put them away on reserve lands well away from the city so that they couldn't, get in the way of white Europeans and their new country. And then, of course, residential schools were created through the Indian Act as well. Maybe one thing I'll leave you with here, because we've only got a few minutes left, but is that the Indian Act still exists, shockingly. This is it. So if you want to see it and read through it, this is the Indian Act. It's been modified a bunch of times, and so a lot of the really kind of racist stuff has been removed, right? So the things that made their cultural practices illegal have been removed. Permission to leave the reserve without, you need to get an Indian agent's permission. That's gone, right? So a lot of the really awful stuff has been removed, but the legislation itself is still here, right? And you can see there's, it talks about membership of registration of Indians, so determining who is and who is not an Indian according to the government. Reserves and sort of rules about reserves. Let's see, mentally incompetent, guardianship, money of infant children, loans to Indians, farms, treaty money, taxation, legal rights. Yeah, so all of this stuff is still on the books. Yeah.
So the Indigenous people, are they originated from India?
Nope.
So are they called Indians?
Because it was a mistake, because Christopher Columbus called them Indians to begin with, because he thought he was in India.
So since that time until now, they're also known as Indians.
Well, that's the thing, is we don't usually we don't use Indian anymore, right? So I used to have a slide on this. So First Nations and First Peoples are good, right? They describe accurately that these are the first peoples that are here. Indigenous is good. What does indigenous mean? When something's indigenous? Because you can have people, but you can also have plants and animals that are indigenous to an area. They're native, right? They come from, the plant or animal comes from that area. That's what makes it indigenous. Yes, so Aboriginal is also used. Some people are kind of on the fence about Aboriginal, because if you're abnormal, what are you? You're not normal, right? So if you're Aboriginal, you're not but they are original, are they not? Yeah. So
That's what they call the Indigenous people in Australia.
yeah. So it kind of depends on who you ask. Aboriginal is okay as well. I steer away from it because, again, some people have pointed out that, well, yeah, Aboriginal is not original. And when I heard that, I was like, yeah, you're right. Why would we use that term then? So some people will still use it. It's okay. We generally don't use Indian anymore unless it's to do with the Indian Act here, because it's a piece of legal language, but it's not right. Native is something that that's a tricky word too.
People who are originated from particular place.
That's what it means, yes. In the past in Canada, Native kind of it picked up kind of a bad, there's kind of a bad feeling around it, right? Like it was used in, like the word Native was used in sort of kind of a racist way, and so it's kind of like it doesn't feel good anymore, that word, even though it technically means.
It's like neglected.
It means what?
It's like neglected.
Not quite. It's the difference between denotation and connotation, right? So what a word denotes is what it actually is, and the connotation is kind of the association, right? So if I say, oh, there's a rat, right? We know a rat is a small furry creature, right? But if I say you're a rat, that has a negative connotation, right? I'm calling you a bad thing.
Yeah.
And so it's the same thing with native. Native has, it denotes something that comes from a particular area, but its connotation is like, it doesn't feel good anymore because it was used in a racist fashion. Yeah. Yeah. So I would stick with Indigenous or First Nations or First Peoples. I think those are probably the best ones. Aboriginal's okay sometimes, depending on who you talk to. I'd steer away from Native for sure, and Indian unless you're talking about the Indian Act. Which is interesting because I wonder why they didn't go through and just change Indian to Indigenous. That's a pretty easy amendment. Doesn't change anything, but I don't know. But yeah, here it is. And actually, if you're interested, you can go on to, if you're interested in this stuff, you can go onto the Department of Justice website here, and you can read any of the laws of Canada. So if you're curious, anything can be read there. And also, you can also go to the House of Commons here. And so if you're interested in government, you can see what the government is up to. So if you go to parliamentary business here, bills, there we go. So this is actually the things that the government is working on. So you can, so currently the government I think is not sitting, but, oh yeah, so here's what's on the agenda, right? They've got an act for administering oaths to office, to amend the Judges Act and the Criminal Code. This is all stuff the government's working on, right? This one, here's a social justice one, an act to amend the Criminal Code to prohibit conversion therapy. So some people like to run little camps and programs that if you're gay, you can go there and they will convert you into straight. Those things don't work. you can't
They really want to be converted.
No.
Why is it there?
Because they're mostly run by religious groups who think that, homosexuality is wrong and a sin, and so they think they can train people into being straight. But you can't. So the government here was going to make those things illegal in Canada, but they didn't really get to it before their summer vacation. So it's still here. But you can see the progress, right? So you can read the bill if you want. Sorry, I know this. You can read the bill if you desire to see what they're talking about, and you can see where it is, right? So there's usually 3 readings for a bill before it gets voted on. And so here you can see that, yeah, the bill had its first reading in October. It had its second reading here again in October. It went to committee. It's had its third reading. The Senate has reviewed it, but it hasn't actually been voted on yet. But you can tell where the government is in terms of dealing with this. So again, if you're interested in this kind of stuff, it's all there for you to read, should you desire. Anyway, okie dokie, that's all we have for today. So, oh shoot, I'm going to hand back your quizzes tomorrow because I did want to review them. Sorry, Rafay, I ran out of time. That's bad. We'll do that tomorrow, and then I have some video to show you as well, which should be interesting for you. But until then, I will see you tomorrow or in 20 minutes. Have a nice afternoon, okay?